It's for me a great pleasure to present you Professor Nokwanda, Nox for friends, Makungas, from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, where she has established the very productive area of medicinal plant biotechnology. Among her honors, Professor Makunga received the National Science and Technology Forum Annual Award for Distinguished Young Black Female Researcher in 2011 and the T.W. Kambule National Research Foundation Award in 2012. In 2017 and 2018, she was a Fulbright researcher scholar at the University of Minnesota. And more recently, in 2022, Knox was a finalist in the National Science and Technology Forum Awards for Science Communication. And you will soon see why she received this award, because she's really an excellent communicator. Fortunately, although she began working with Mediterranean plants, such as Tapsia garganica, she decided to move to her homeland plants. And her research is focused on the place where all of us, where botanists cannot die before visiting it, South Africa. I'm sure that once you listen to her, you will decide to go to the next IBC Congress in South Africa. Her research has a multidirectional approach that combines the areas of biotechnology, ethnopharmacology, and phytochemistry. She uses cutting-edge multiomics technologies to understand how plants function at genetic and biochemical levels to produce their secondary metabolites that we use as in the medicinal plants. But she has not only provided tools for conserving indigenous medicinal plants, but her work is sensitive to local healers and local communities' needs, promoting opportunities for socioeconomic development in an area where medicinal plants are still critical for the health of the population. But besides all these honors, I want to highlight that she is at the forefront of inclusive research. Quoting her own words, a mission not necessarily linked to my research is to bring awareness to the fact that women and people of color can actually do science. I want to highlight that this is a potential career choice for young people in South Africa, where the population don't always have an easy access to enter into STEM subjects. I am passionate about communicating science to highlight to others that people that look like me are actually out there doing science. And now, I don't want to take up another minute of your time because the person everyone wants to hear is you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much. I really, really appreciate that introduction. I am also very grateful to Gonzalo for the invite. It's really exciting to be here in Madrid. The last time I was in Madrid, I was actually listening to a piano recital, and so it feels very much different now to be on the stage. And hopefully my talk will be able to entice many of you about these wonderful plants that we have in South Africa, and that might encourage you to come and visit us down in the Cape. So without much further ado, I'm going to delve into the South African medicinal treasures, and I will share several different videos and hopefully lots of plant images and some new information. So many of us might be well aware that South Africa is home to 3 different biodiversity hotspots. And I'm just going to define what these hotspots are, especially for those that might be streaming online. And so we have the Cape Floristic region, which has this wonderful concentration of very unique plants. And in the Cape, you will find the iconic species such as Proteus cineroides, or the king protea, as well as restios that have radiated throughout the Cape Floristic region. And I'm also going to mention the group Ericaceae, which is also really very species rich with many different forms. And there are many other different plants that are actually found in this area. So it's a really exciting place to be. Apart from that, we also have the succulent Karoo, which is a semi-arid area that spans a large part of South Africa, and we have the largest concentration of succulents in the whole entire world. And these succulents actually are so special that many other people that are interested in succulent plants are actually even starting to poach them. So at this moment, we are worried about some of these very specifically localized succulent species, such as conophytums, that have now been finding themselves to be in an illicit trade. Apart from this, there's a region called the Maputo-Pondoland-Albany Corridor. I'm probably not going to say that again, because that's a mouthful, especially for 7 o'clock in the evening. And so I'll probably just call it the MPA. And here, again, you find plants that are quite unique. About 1,900 in that area are said to be very specialized endemic. And so South Africa sits in one of these zones in the world that happen to be a mega biodiversity area. And the CFR, or the Cape Floristic region, is in a non-tropical area. It has a Mediterranean climate, but it has many unique specializations in terms of the plants. And so I just want to share some of these plants with you. I think this one has had a name change, or at least we are thinking that it should have a name change, seeing that it is at this stage called Erythrina caffra, but soon to be Erythrina afra, based on what I've been seeing in relation to the nomenclature symposium. And I think that's a very good move. And then we have plants such as, let me get this across, such as that one, the quiver tree, which of course is now being used as a model species to try and understand changes of plant populations in relation to climate change. And yes, of course, I'm going to bring up Hoodia. There was a lot of controversy in relation to that particular succulent, which is pollinated by flies and was being commercialized as an appetite suppressant. But that particular project actually failed because the benefit sharing agreements were not necessarily in place at the time of that commercialization. And last but not least, I think I'm getting that onto Siphonochilus aethopicus, or the wild African ginger, which is a species that has been wild harvested so much that it actually has gone extinct in places in that MPA region indicated in orange. And now harvesting has actually moved on to Mozambique, and that is the part that's indicated in brown. However, although plants are being utilized by people, and this of course is very important, we still need to be aware of the fact that often plant use has been conservative throughout time. But before I get into that particular topic, I just want to share with you some of these botanical riches of South Africa. And you will see that there are many different floral forms. These plants are found in different parts of South Africa in very unique environments. They are well adapted to those particular environments. Some of these environments are very nutrient poor. Some of those environments are out in the desert. But when the rains come, you will find an explosion of flowers, and they are so neatly and funkily unique to those environments, knowing when it is that they actually need to pop up and flower. At the same time, you've got wonderful pollination syndromes. I think Alan Ellis shared about some of those in his talk yesterday. And you have convergent evolution in relation to pollinators, as well as the plants that we hypothesize has been important in establishing this incredible floral diversity. And those plants have been very important to people throughout time, And if we cast our way back into the days of the Dutch East India Company, when the stopping place was in the Cape, and you would find that ships would stop, and then the Europeans would end up interacting with the local people. Those were the Kwekwe and the San people, the first peoples of that area. And there was probably some knowledge sharing, because there has been documentation that the local indigenous people would actually tend to the people that were in the ships as part of this traverse in source of interesting resources. And one of the early documentations in relation to the ethnobotany of South Africa was actually linked to that wonderful man that I've actually shown over there. His name was Pape, and he collected information about these very strange plants that he was actually seeing in the Cape region. And so that interaction, I think, started the first recordals of indigenous knowledge associated with medicinal flora of South Africa. And this fascination with South African plants also led to some of these plants being taken from South Africa, these bulbs, being taken from South Africa and being transported to places like the Netherlands, where they ended up in different collections. And as such, you find that now you can find South African plants pretty much all over the world in relation to their ornamental beauty. And this ethnobotanical sharing of information, I think, was quite important, because even at that time, it established what was then regarded as the Dutch herbal system, Cape Dutch herbal system, which utilized Western practices and infusing that with South African flora. And the people that were central to this were the Aboriginal people, the Kwekwe and the San people at the time, who have passed on that information from one generation to another generation throughout time until they interacted with the Bantu people who came from central parts of Africa all the way down. And this again caused another amalgamation of histories and creating of a unique indigenous knowledge systems platform, which was also associated with knowledge that came from the East, and that was actually linked to the slave trade of South Africa, which brought slaves from various parts of Asia. And so you find now that we have multiple indigenous knowledge systems because we have bicultural diversity. And that bicultural diversity, together with our plant diversity, and you multiply that with your chemical diversity, really leads to botanical treasures, and that can be exploited as part of the economic botany of South Africa. And so if I look a little bit deeper into this indigenous knowledge, you will find that you've got different types of people that are exploiting South African plants. And I think the easiest way maybe to understand this is to take a look at the 11 official languages that we have in South Africa. So we have 11 official languages, a 12th official language being sign language, but each of those official languages is actually linked to a group of people: the English, the Afrikaans, the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Tswana, the Sotho, the Pedi, and so forth. And each of those different groupings probably carries their own source of indigenous knowledge. And so that cultural diversity really is a very inspiring place for somebody that's interested in how plants are used by people. And those ancient uses are actually brought into a modern context. They are very dynamic, and sometimes you find the Rastafarian herbalists selling plants on the streets of Cape Town, and also considering the call of using ancient medicine in a very modern setting. And so you have a large cultural diversity. So if we look and we travel all the way to the MPA region, you're going to meet up with Igqirha. I don't know how many people can do that click, but I've been practicing since I was probably about 4 years old. And Igqirha is a healer that has a spiritual calling. Even Isangoma is a Zulu name for the traditional healer that has these divine abilities for intervention. But you have a very different group of people that are active in the Cape Floristic region. It is usually a male Rastafarian. And the Rastas think that they play a very significant role in their communities because they bring a knowledge that has actually been largely eroded as a result of the brutal history that is linked to apartheid in South Africa. In the 1960s, the Witchcraft Act of 1965 actually abolished the practice of traditional medicine. And so Rastafarianism was then seen as a way to be able to carry this knowledge because it was started in Ethiopia. Rastafarianism was started in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is actually the only country in Africa that was never colonized. And so the Rastas feel that they have a very important place in society and that they carry information that's exceedingly useful that comes from their forefathers. And now I'd like to play this video, if we can get it going for me. Thank you.
How did I end up here? Drenched and perched precariously atop a South African mountain. Well, I'm undergoing a cleansing ceremony with a traditional healer. Traditional healers believe they receive supernatural guidance from ancestral spirits and have been part of Africa's social fabric for centuries. These shamans use traditional medicines and rituals to help improve people's mental health. Healers are vital in Africa, where there's a severe shortage of therapists across the continent. And they're increasingly popular among younger people. But why?
You can go down any street, any corner, and somebody will be able to point you in the direction of a traditional healer.
Well, they're still popular because the people in the community still believe that their methods and their medicines work.
I think that when people go through things that they cannot explain, like depression or anxiety, they go to the people that they've heard about from their fathers or their grandfathers. They go to traditional healers.
Traditional healers have helped my family and extended family during our time of grieving with cleansing, so that we can be hopeful that everything will be okay after our time of grief.
Traditional healers aren't just popular with residents. More and more psychiatrists and psychologists are working with them to improve South Africa's mental health system. Let's find out more. This is Mindset.
Traditional healing has always been put again.
Okay, thank you.
is one of
Okay, I'm going to move us along. Okay, so I think that video really showed why traditional medicines are so important in the South African context. A larger population of South Africans actually use traditional medicines, 60 to 80%. And I would say that we probably use dual systems of healing. I don't know about you, but I really do like to drink rooibos. And that rooibos has got many medicinal properties, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. And then at the same time, this trade is very important for people because it actually generates a livelihood. You've got collectors who then sell to traders, and those traders then sell to consumers. And that is part of this underground economy or informal economy of medicinal plants. And much of that is actually wild harvested. On the other hand, you find that there are more traditional healers in South Africa than there are Western-trained medical doctors. And access to primary health care can be very expensive and difficult. And so, traditional medicines have a very important place in the South African context. At the same time, because we've got so many plants, 4,000 to about 5,000 plants or so that are used on a day-to-day basis for health purposes, this is a very important repository of potential new chemical entities and new medicines. And so the plant-based pharmaceutical industry in South Africa is also growing. And you find plants such as this pelargonium right here, Pelargonium pseudoides, being extracted from the wild, but also cultivated in order to supply a growing industry for products such as Umka Cold Care, which is the brand name of that herbal extract that's used for respiratory infections. In South Africa, South Africans, I'm sure you've used Lintogon, and Lintogon contains a Pelargonium pseudoides extract that is very important for upper respiratory and lower respiratory infections. And so that provides a basis for plants that can then be supplemented into the bioeconomy. And if we look at the research that is able to assist that growing bioeconomy, you will find that much research has only really started after 1994. And that is in the post-apartheid era. The South African government pumped a lot of money into the IKS program in order to encourage research, which has gone from chemical isolations, looking at in vitro assays, working with animal models, and then proceeding into the clinical space. And at this particular time, I think in South Africa, there's a lot of work that's being conducted at different population levels, trying to better understand how these medicinal plants are actually affected by their environments. And at the same time, there's a lot of new drug discovery activities that are taking place. But I think the largest gaps in our knowledge are linked to the fact that we don't have references for these plants. The quality standards are also not necessarily up to the highest level. And there are gaps in terms of the chemical characterization of the extracts that people are utilizing and even trying to commercialize. And so now I'm going to get on to the next phase of this lecture, and I will try and unlock this botanical treasure trove, and I will focus on a few species as examples. I take you into my lab and also onto our campus at Stellenbosch. You see the people that are walking on that picture, they're actually walking on top of our library. And if you look at the white buildings that are situated in that region there, those buildings belong to the viticulture and enology department. That's where the winemakers are actually trained. So if you've ever had any South African wine, which is also quite diverse in its platform, you would have experienced some of the work that comes out of that particular department. And then opposite those buildings that are indicated would be where I actually sit. So let's open the door to my lab and meet some of the plants and the people that work in my particular environment. So we utilize a variety of different platforms. It's a very integrated approach. We go outside, we interact with the plants in their natural environment. We have the capacity to be able to utilize a range of biotechnological tools, starting from plant tissue culture, going through to genetic engineering. And then we also have some very sophisticated instruments that allow us to be able to see deep into the metabolome, which is responsible for this collection of chemicals that ultimately are important for health. We also use a variety of genetic and genomic tools to better understand relationships of the plants that we are actually working with. And we also make some extracts that go for biological testing, and much of that work actually takes place in collaboration with others. And although I might not longer be working on Mediterranean plants, I thought it was quite important for me to put this one as a short little summary of the past work that I did on salvias. I worked on South African salvias, and some of those salvias, such as Salvia aurea, have antifungal activity, particularly against fusarium, which can be a problem when it infects staple foods. It leads to mycotoxins, and those mycotoxins can ultimately cause cancers. So I think this extract has a potential in the agricultural industry, and you can see that the chemistry is actually associated with plant ecotypes. And that seems to be a running thread, and I'll talk about that in the next example that follows. Now I want us to just cast an eye to how this particular species has found itself pretty much all over the world. It really has traversed the whole entire globe, and I call it a globe trotter. Some people think that the center of endemism happens to be in Australia, but you can find it in China, you can find it in India, you find this genus in South Africa and other parts of Africa, East Africa, and even in parts of the Americas. And wherever this species is found, Dodonea viscosa, which belongs to the family Sapiendaceae, people exploit it for a variety of different reasons. In South Africa, it's generally used to treat influenza. It is one of those key ingredients in any Rastafarian bush doctor mixture. In Afrikaans, it's called Eysterhout, which means iron wood. And so that name almost alludes to its iron strength in healing the body. Our work has actually shown that it has anti-cancer activity against a breast cancer cell line. This work was done in collaboration with Anna Mart Engelbrecht, who's a human physiologist at Stellenbosch University, and in close collaboration with the Cape Bush Doctors. We go collecting with the bush doctors, we harvest the plants that they say give them the feeling, and then we try and translate what that feeling is into scientific terms. And so we know that the species can kill cancer. It does this through various apoptotic markers. And so we went and collected from different areas. Along with the bush doctors, we went to the Cederberg, which is a coastal area in South Africa. We went to, the Cederberg is right deep in the mountains. De Hoop sits in the coastal areas, and then as well as just outside of our campus in Stellenbosch. And we then looked at these plants that the bush doctors said we should actually collect. And we did this work with Ms. Hoffman, who's currently conducting her PhD studies. And in that picture, she's actually wearing a Dodonea crown. And so we took the wild collected plants and we tried to understand their metabolomic patterns. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a short little game here. Anyone that's over 1.8 meters tall, please put up your hand. Anyone that's between 1.5 and 1.79, please put up your hand. Okay? And then anybody that's shorter than that. Okay, so before I actually did that assay, I wasn't necessarily able to see the patterns or who was tall and who wasn't tall. But the moment I started to interrogate that data and try and look deeper into it, using some kind of classification, I was then able to see where the largest group of people that were tall were actually positioned. And this is exactly the same way that you can actually interpret that graph that's actually sitting up there. So all the peach-colored blocks belong to the Cedarburg, and they cluster at a much higher level or different part of the PCA, whereas the purple and the blue cluster together, so they associate closer to each other, meaning that they're closely related in relation to their chemistry. And if you just look at the patterns and you compare the wild population versus the cultivated population, you'll see that you pretty much have exactly the same way of grouping. And so this says to us that there is potential to cultivate Dodonea viscosa if we're going to commercialize this extract as an adjuvant treatment for breast cancer, colon cancer, cancers of the esophagus, as well as pancreatic cancer, which we know it actually is active against. And so, apart from looking at these three populations, we extended our interest. It also was just a really nice excuse to get out of the Cape and go to other parts of the country. And so we got onto driving to different parts of South Africa. We went to the Eastern Cape, which is where I'm actually originally from. That's the MPA region. And then we also traveled up to KwaZulu-Natal, which also falls in that MPA region. And we collected plants from various localities. What was really interesting is that the plants from the Cape, irrespective of the region in the Cape where they came from, seem to share relatedness. Whereas the plants that are actually coming from KwaZulu-Natal, right over there, seem to have many different compounds that are not, at this stage, well defined. And this extract is rich in terpenoids, it's rich in flavonoids, and it is also very rich in a variety of chemicals that we actually don't know. And we look at this from a morphological perspective, from a photosynthesis perspective, and again, we see the same patterns. The Cape plants seem to group together, whereas the plants that are coming from KwaZulu-Natal have got a different leaf area and a different method or ways of photosynthesizing. And this extract, when combined with chemotherapy, such as doxorubicin, that's used for breast cancer, as well as paclitaxel, it actually has concentrations or dosages where you see synergistic effects, and those are the red dots on that particular set of graphs. And so we think that we can use a very specific dose and use that in conjunction with regular chemotherapies that's already out there in the market, and this will lead to less toxic effects, and also it might mean that people are on a lower regime of the chemotherapy if they use this in combination. What's also very interesting is that the aqueous extract, the water extract, also has very good activity. Now, I want to turn to another very interesting species, and this one is from the succulent Karoo area. It belongs to the family Asioaceae, and I'm going to carry on calling it Sciletium totosum, even though it may be referred to as Mesembryanthemum totosum. It's a little bit harder for me to get to the mesem part. And in the industry, people still call it Sciletium. And we've been looking at different plants of this particular species. And again, we went to different areas of South Africa. And this took us into the desert areas of the Namaqualand. These plants are exceedingly elusive to find. They occur as very small populations. Sometimes it's a tiny little bundle that's actually hiding behind other plants. And so you really need to have a lot of practice in order to be able to notice them. And as a result, because they were so difficult to find, Kaelan Reddy, who was doing a PhD at that time, decided to start doing the Sciletium jump every time he actually found a plant. So you'll see lots of pictures of all of us jumping in all of these different areas that we actually visited. We focused on the intrapopulation variation linked to Sciletium totosum, but then also the other related species of this particular plant. And I think I've just got some nice pretty pictures here for us, different variations of the Sciletium jump, and you can see sometimes it really is wonderful down in the Cape, especially when the water has been abundant. You'll see lots of lovely blooms. This project also meant that we got to meet a whole bunch of different new people who actually took us on our Sciletium hunt. And many of these people had very rich and deep knowledge about this particular species. And so I would like to play this next video.
Die is 'n kougaplantjie, 'n kougoedplantjie. Ons noem hom 'n kougoed, soos die ou mense ons geleer het. Dis kougoed. En kougoed kry jy in die veld, hy groei onder 'n ander bossie in. En ou mense het ons geleer, jy pluk die bossie en dan kry jy van die blaartjie. Kry jy 'n stukkie van die blaartjie. Hierdie plant is baie goed vir babas wat suur het, pasgebore babas of vir babas wat suur het. Dan jy vat die blaartjie en jy spoel hom af en jy sit dit in 'n skoon lappie. Dan jy draai die lappie net so draaitjie, dan kom die sappies uit. Dan jy kan van die moedersmelk bygooi, by die sappies. En miskien bietjie wonderkroon en behoud met dis botteltjies medisyne. Die kougoed help om die baba rustig te maak en dit help om die maagie te kalmeer van die suur. En dit laat ook die baba goed slaap. Die is 'n kougaplantjie, 'n kougoed.
Okay, so that was Tina Papas, who was really very helpful in our collections as she took us around and we met her family. And I was really so excited to see her engaging the young people and actually teaching them about these plants. And the way in which she collects, she's not necessarily as conservative as we were. We were taking about 10 centimeters. She actually plucks up the whole entire plant when she actually collects Sciletium. But I'll go back to the reasons of why she might be utilizing that method. So this particular part of the project actually allowed us to be able to look at different elevations. We were able to look at plants that were occurring at high elevation, as well as those plants that were actually also occurring at low elevation. And we were then able to compare their metabolomic profiles. And it was quite interesting that within the Sciletium totosum populations, we could actually identify several different chemotypes which we thought were very interesting. And some of these chemotypes that I've actually highlighted in yellow, we actually did an animal study in relation to those particular plants. And one chemotype, I'm not going to say which one, was very active in this animal study, and we could actually better understand the pathways of the brain that were actually being activated in relation to this particular extract, to the point that it's actually now gone into commercialization. And that commercial activity will then benefit those people that are closely aligned to these plants. And the SAN Council is currently in negotiations with us in terms of a benefit sharing agreement. And so what was quite interesting is that we were able to choose the right chemotype, but we were just also quite fascinated by what the elevation might actually imply from a biochemical perspective, because some plants were accumulating high mesembrine alkaloids. That's the one group of alkaloids that occur at very high levels in these plants, whereas another group that was growing at low elevation had a different set of alkaloids. And these demethylated alkaloids are occurring at much lower levels. But the chemotype that we actually chose to commercialize has a lot more of these minor alkaloids, which previously have been ignored. So this implies that these minor alkaloids also have a very key biological function in treating anxiety, stress, depression, as well as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because they actually bind much tighter to receptors that control those particular diseases. But what might this idea of differences linked to elevation actually say from a biosynthesis perspective? We know that mesembrines are synthesized via phenylalanine and tyrosine, and both of those pathways ultimately lead to mesembrine. But what's really interesting is that the moment you have high elevation, you seem to have a different scenario. What actually happens is that the plants at high elevation are under various different stresses, including UV stress, and it seems that a different pathway is then elicited, and that leads to the production of betalains. And betalains are produced also via tyrosine. So at high elevation, you have accumulation of betalains, the pigments, which are used as a sunscreen, I suppose, and then you also have accumulation of these mesembrine alkaloids. So those two pathways are existing in those plants that are being exposed to high elevation, or they're more highly expressed. And remember, I said something about Tina and how she actually pulls up the whole plant. Some of our work has actually shown that every single leaf of Scaletium has a different profile of these mesembrine alkaloids, and it seems that mesembrine synthesis is occurring in the leaves, and then some of those metabolites might be transported and actually localized in the roots. And so this work also validates the practice of local indigenous people who actually uproot the whole entire plant, because it means that they have access to a more holistic compilation of these mesembrine alkaloids that have health beneficiation. And I did mention that we are commercializing this extract that we've been working with, one particular extract of Scaletium. We are sharing the benefits with the SAN Council. And the way in which it works in South Africa is that the government actually identifies the benefit-sharing partner, and previously we have actually been in a project where we shared benefits with the Chagabe Kingdom, and that was linked to commercialization of some IP and then development of a product. I'm exceedingly excited about this Fayenti product that's coming out. It is almost available for people to purchase, and if you really are in need of good sleep, includes me, then you are an ideal candidate for clock out. My last example is linked to Aspergillus lianaris. I end it with every South African's favorite tea, rooibos, and you will probably drink lots of rooibos when you join us for IBC down in the Cape. Catherine Wilkinson, who was involved in making many of these sketches that I've used throughout my presentation, has been doing this work. We found that different populations of the Fabaceae, of this particular Fabaceae, have variable chemistry, but again, it is site-specific. What's also very interesting is that if you look at a microsatellite analysis and you also do a genetic analysis using several different markers, ITS markers and some nuclear markers, you can actually tease out the genetic relationships associated with these plants. And in this particular case, there seems to be a haplotype difference that's associated with the reseeders that sit in the Cedarburg area versus the resprouters that sit in the Northern Cape. Because this particular species has got different phenological means of functioning. And a lot of the Northern Cape is actually, and even the Cedarburg, is actually being turned for rooibos farming. That is also causing an extinction threat. And in response to that, we've actually developed a micropropagation protocol for rooibos. My last idea that I want to leave with you is some work that we have been doing very recently, and that's actually looking at the effect of rooibos against skin cancer. And using a proteomic analysis where we look at as many proteins as is possible, using a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry platform, we are able to see a mass amount of proteins that are changing when we treat a melanoma cell line with the rooibos extract. And what's really interesting is that there are many different pathways of action that are linked to that particular activity. Some of it is linked to changes into the mitochondrial function. Some of it is actually associated with signaling mechanisms that ultimately signal pathways that cause structural changes to the cancer cells and ultimately lead to cell death. So it's a very complex network of function, and it's not just one mode of action in relation to that extract. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this evening I've been able to convince you that South African plants are phenomenal, and the people that carry the knowledge of those plants have a rich repository of information about these plants that are very unique in terms of their character. And last but not least, that working in this particular area is a balancing act. You've got to balance people and plants. You've got to balance people and environment. And hopefully that all of this will ultimately lead to some kind of economic goods that will benefit more than just myself. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for listening, my collaborators, and the various different students that have been involved in this project. And I would also like to thank all of the indigenous knowledge holders who have held on to this knowledge throughout time so that I would be able to do the work that I do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nox, for this wonderful and really beautiful and attractive presentation. We have now time for questions.
Okay, now. I have a question concerning the Scaletium tortuosum. I'm not sure if it's really important that the time of day when you harvest the leaves, because it's also a lineage that can perform cam photosynthesis, so the photosynthesis is sort of shifted between day and night. So are there any specifications when it's best to harvest them?
We haven't necessarily looked at day and night harvesting because we normally actually go out during the day so that we can see the plants in the wild. But that might be an interesting experiment to set up, you know, in a lab environment. We have noticed, and we did some of this work earlier on as part of another PhD project, I didn't really go into this, that there are definite seasonal changes in terms of which mesembrine alkaloids are accumulating in these plants, and that there is definitely a shift in terms of whether it's minor alkaloids or more major alkaloids that are actually accumulated, and that is definitely linked to season. And so the day and night shift we haven't looked at, but I am very much well aware that, you know, you have cam photosynthesis here, which makes things a little bit more complicated. And actually, I didn't share this data set as I have presented it at other meetings before, but if they are under different types of stresses, so a drought stress or a nutrient stress, you have quite severe impacts in relation to glycolysis. You see many different proteins that are linked to glycolysis start to be differentially regulated in relation to different kinds of stresses. So there seems to be something linked to stress that I think is affecting these plants, but I really am not sure how much is switched on at night and how much is switched off, and how that metabolism is actually working in relation to that particular biorhythm. But that's an interesting project to undertake.
Oh, hello. First of all, thank you for this inspiring work. Congratulations. And my question is regarding all the chemotypes that you have been finding through your studies. I was wondering, have the people that you have met in different locations also told you, for example, to put it in this way, oh, we find these plants that are in these higher altitudes or in this part or in this valley, like we prefer them when we go and search for these medicinal plants because we find them to be like better for the things that we want to cure or for the effect that we are searching for? Thank you.
Yes, very much so. So I showed a picture of some Rastafarian healers, and then also Tina's family. There was a picture of many different faces, and that particular group of herbalists actually operate in the Namakwaland area, and they took us specifically to an area that's quite remote and is almost like a secret area where they go and actually collect. So people are often quite willing to share that kind of information. We've also, as I mentioned, we have also looked at what happens if you actually collect along a gradient. So the Rastafarian bush doctors often prefer to go to the top of the mountain because they say that the plants along that path are actually strongest. And as they walk, they're actually tasting what these plants are going to feel like. And some work that we have actually done on Dodonea, on those collections that we collected along a gradient, we could definitely separate out these chemotypes based on elevation. So there's an incredible amount of information that's locked into indigenous people, which sometimes we are able to translate or at least provide some kind of scientific backing for.
Yeah, also thank you from my side for your presentation. I would have the question, you said that some of the medicines are being brought to the market, so there will be a higher demand for plant material. Are these plants then going to be cultivated, or is there a danger of them being over-harvested because you need more plant material? I would like to know something about that. Thank you.
I'm very much well aware that we cannot service industries where you're going to demand large amounts of material and still be reliant solely on wild plants. So with the Dodonea, we have a protocol that we have established in our environment for cultivation, and we are actually now moving that particular protocol to a large scale. So it's actually going to an agricultural company that's now going to, do thousands of little Dodoneas, and hopefully that in itself then creates new jobs for people that are going to be working within that industry, but then it also takes us out of wild harvesting. It also means that you can have a more predictable extract in terms of the chemistry, because the plants in the wild are also adjusting themselves to environments, to different environmental changes. With Scaletium, there are already people that are growing the different chemotypes. There's quite a large agricultural industry around Scaletium in South Africa. And the chemotype that we have identified that's going into the Fienti product is actually being grown in the area where it actually came from. And the community of people that live in that area will also participate in actually growing this particular species, because that then also allows them to be able to enter into that market. So we're sourcing our material from the region where we collected. The people that are growing the plants are from that particular area. And in that way, we hope that we can leave the wild populations alone, but at the same time be able to exploit that biodiversity in a very sustainable way.
There was a question over there.
Hi there. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Unfortunately, I was not able to see the beginning of it, so please forgive me if you covered this. But could you please elaborate on the different dimensions of benefit sharing that you've encountered, what you've observed in these different communities? And I guess I'm hoping to hear some interesting new ideas of things that you've encountered. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I didn't delve deeply into benefit sharing in my at the introduction. I kind of mentioned some examples of projects that failed, and then I mentioned one or two ideas in relation to how we've been going about it. But this is something that's exceedingly tricky to do. It's not very easy, because often as researchers, you arrive there, you say, we might be exploring this, and we don't know where it's going to lead. And it's very important that one doesn't create a preconceived notion that sometime in the future, there's a truckload that's just going to land in that community with a whole bunch of South African rands or US dollars. Because this can really cause problems if your project is no longer successful, because now you've created the expectation that people are going to benefit from something, but you're still at the pre-discovery phase. So in South Africa, the way that this benefit sharing is controlled is actually via the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And when you start a project, you have to have a declaration saying, I'm starting a project and what it is that you're going to do. And then if you do go into commercialization, whether you're licensing new IP, whether you're going to produce a product, whatever commercial platform that you might be using based on the information that you acquired from other people, you then need to enter into a benefit sharing agreement. And that is a collaborative discussion between the two parties. So you, as the parties involved, define what this benefit sharing is going to look like. It can be monetary, it can also be non-monetary benefits. And some people are opting solely for a monetary, some people are doing a dual system. In some cases, non-monetary benefits could include providing some kind of education to communities that they can then exploit to be able to further themselves. So how do you grow scaletium? If it's a plant that you've never grown before, you need somebody to actually teach you how to grow it so that you can sell it into the market and then own your own monetary benefits in that way. Other non-monetary benefits include setting up a fund, so that's originally monetary, but then maybe to support a bursary for somebody that is from that particular community so that they can actually get an education. So the negotiations are usually one-on-one with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment assisting with those negotiations. But it can be very tricky, and we are all meant to comply, and I'm not really sure how many people do comply.
I was wondering if, beside angiosperm, there is information on the use of mosses, for example, for medical purposes.
Excuse me, please say that for me again.
Beside flowering plants, are there information on the use of, for example, bryophytes, mosses?
You know, the crazy thing about this is that pretty much all living organisms are used. There are certain parts of South Africa, if you go there, in KwaZulu-Natal, in Durban, I think it's the largest medicinal market in South Africa. Alwyn is agreeing with me. It's huge. The level of what you see there in terms of biodiversity is outstanding. It is from the sea all the way across. Everything is there, animals, plants, mosses, lichens, the whole lot. So I think the answer to that question would be yes. If there is some medicinal benefit, then people would use it. Sometimes it's not necessary for a physical benefit, but rather for a spiritual benefit or a psychological benefit. But I would say yes.
I would like to ask also a question.
Sure.
Okay. Have you studied or read about these species that are used more for spiritual healing? If there are any patterns in these plants, maybe colors, maybe the scent, odors? Have you read or if there is a pattern, you know, a trait that plants use in ritual healing?
I think for spiritual healing in South Africa, you have some plants that are very important. Some of the helichrysums, for example, you know, these are used for every ritual that you go and meet a Sangoma or a traditional medicine person, they will definitely burn this different kinds of helichrysum. So there are certain plants that are more important than others. But I think it's very difficult to say a particular trait is solely used for spiritual purposes. Because again, I think it's across the board. Some people will say, you know, I'm going to hang something outside of my house, haworthias, for example. You know, I'll have them around my house because that protects me from evil. But it really is across the whole entire spectrum. I think the work of Gary Stafford is very interesting because he worked a lot on plants that are used for central nervous system purposes, including plants that might be used in spiritual rituals. And he did an excellent inventory of all of the plants that are used in South Africa for that particular purpose. So that's a nice place to go. But I wouldn't necessarily say if they smell a certain way. You also find a lot of the bulbs that have alkaloids are also very much used for spiritual purposes because, of course, they work on the brain. So, yeah, I think many different plants end up in the local ethnopharmacopoeia in South Africa.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nox, for this excellent talk. I'm really looking forward to see these plants in South Africa and think that many of us will join to see them. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk.
Thank you, everybody.